Hi, good afternoon. I'm Samantha Bingham. I'm the Clean Transportation Program Director for the City of Chicago's Department of Transportation. I also serve as the coordinator for the Chicago Area Clean Cities Coalition. And today I am here joined by Tim Milburn to talk about electric vehicles for Elmhurst. And so the reason why someone from the City of Chicago is here today is because of the Clean Cities program. So Clean Cities is actually a Department of Energy program that started in the early 90s. So our coalition is actually nearly 30 years old. The coalition is comprised of public and private partners throughout the region who are working together to reduce petroleum use in the transportation sector. So that's the mission of the Department of Energy's program. Here in our region, we are one of nearly 80 coalitions across the country. So we're doing this work on the ground while the Department of Energy resources us. We chose to become a Clean Cities Coalition for this region because of our poor air quality related to the transportation sector emissions. And so that's why I'm here today. The City of Elmhurst has been a coalition participant for almost 2 decades. The fleet has been certified as green and continues to receive awards for their efforts to help green the fleet. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about electric vehicles. This is quite the potpourri of items we'll be covering this afternoon. I cannot read the agenda, but I'll turn to the side for a second here. So I'll be talking about the electric vehicle goals that the automotive companies and the government has on supporting the electrification of transportation. We'll do a quick EV overview. We'll talk about electric vehicle charging infrastructure options, the current state of public electric vehicle charging infrastructure in the region, what the current infrastructure and vehicle landscape looks like here in Elmhurst. We'll talk about electric vehicle infrastructure solutions and challenges for multi-unit dwellings, the state of Illinois' electric vehicle rebate program, which will be opening up again soon, and then Tim will talk about a workplace charging program that our coalition is involved in called Empower. He'll go deeper into the multi-unit dwelling issue and infrastructure solutions, and then additional electric vehicle and charging infrastructure options and incentives that are forthcoming. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So the state of Illinois in September of last year passed groundbreaking climate and energy policy with the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. So this policy, this legislation set a goal of 1 million electric vehicles in Illinois by 2030. And by electric vehicles, we mean full battery electric vehicles. In order to get to that milestone, there are a number of actions that the state has taken. Some were in the legislation, some have been add-ons since then. The state has provided incentives for manufacturing of components of electric vehicles themselves, battery integrators to help build up the local workforce for electric vehicle supply and manufacturing to be locally accessible. They have, the General Assembly included a number of incentive programs for electric vehicles and infrastructure, right? EVs do cost more at the front end. When you purchase the vehicle, they have a higher purchase price, and then the infrastructure is something that we have to invest in. Now, there's additional investments that need to be made at buildings and existing buildings for homes and the public. And the state itself is committed to electrifying their own fleet. So being a participant in the market, purchasing these vehicles, and making a plan for their use for infrastructure for charging stations. The state is also the Illinois Department of Transportation is working on a statewide EV infrastructure plan that is supporting their plans to then invest nearly $140 million in fast charging EV stations across the state, across our interstate corridors, so we are able to connect communities and connect across states with electric vehicles to perform those trips. The state has also signed an MOU with Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin and Minnesota to collaborate on EV infrastructure for commercial vehicles. So thinking about the electrification of our freight, delivery vehicles, the infrastructure needs that would be needed for interstate commerce. And then lastly, they've also signed an MOU with the other states around Lake Michigan to support EV tourism and ensuring that the infrastructure is available for people to use EVs on trips within the Midwest. So auto manufacturers are also all in on electrification. A number, or the majority of auto manufacturers have made announcements about their billions of dollars in investments in research and development of EVs. They've committed to nearly completely electrifying their portfolio of vehicles that they offer, their products, by 2040. And we, 10 years ago or 12 years ago when highway speed electric vehicles came to market, it was a little shaky. We weren't sure what this meant, if EVs would go away again. The point of all of this is that this is inevitable, that the internationally electric vehicles are on a path to replace a lot of the internal combustion engine vehicles, and this is also happening in the United States. And the reason why electric vehicles are an important vehicle technology is because it helps us to address our climate goals and our air quality goals. So here in the region, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning and the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus completed a regional climate action plan. And so according to the 2015 greenhouse gas emissions inventory in that plan, the transportation sector is responsible for 28% of our greenhouse gas emissions. For our, in terms of air quality impact, the transportation sector is the leading cause of our poor air quality in the region. And we don't meet federal air quality standards because of that. So EVs are more efficient. They have no or little tailpipe emissions if you're talking about a plug-in hybrid vehicle. But while I will say that in some aspects, when you're talking about climate policy and energy policy, EVs seem to be the only solution to addressing our transportation emissions challenges. I will say that biking, active transportation, transit are all more affordable, lesser polluting options. So we also have to balance, all these other transportation options in our strategies when we're talking about reducing emissions from the transportation sector. EVs are still vehicles, was what I want the takeaway to be. The Chicago area is a great place to own and operate an electric vehicle. The vast majority of daily trips are 40 miles or less. That is well within the range of most current electric vehicles and older electric vehicles. Our grid continues to get cleaner and cleaner. I think since 1990, our grid has gotten 25% cleaner from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint, according to the US EPA. And as the grid gets cleaner, our vehicles get cleaner, which is like the opposite of what happens with internal combustion engine vehicles, where the emission systems can start to break down, and that's why we have to go get emissions testing after so many years of having your vehicle. And if you use, so ComEd has an annual energy supply report that they have to provide. And if you take the numbers from their report and you plug it into a Department of Energy tool, you can see that in our region, if you're a ComEd customer, you would have to drive an internal combustion engine vehicle, so a gasoline vehicle that got 80 miles per gallon or more to be a better to have a better impact on climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, compared to an electric vehicle. So while we still compared to an internal combustion engine vehicle. So even though we do still have natural gas and coal and other fossils on our grid, because electric vehicles are more efficient, they still are a win in terms of climate change, climate emissions here in the region. And then we have a lot of vehicles here in the Chicago area that we have an opportunity to switch out. So when we talk about electric vehicles, some auto manufacturers, when they talk about their electric vehicle portfolio, they include hybrids. Hybrids do not plug in to recharge. They have regenerative braking that recharges their batteries. When policymakers are talking about electric vehicles, they typically are talking about battery electric vehicles, which are called full electric vehicles sometimes, and then plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So most plug-in hybrid electric vehicles today, they use a gas engine or a gas motor, and they also have the electric, they have the batteries, and they can use both systems. So you can extend your range with the gas system if need be, and they typically have 20 to 40 miles of all-electric range. For 100% electric vehicles, you always have to plug in. There is no backup system. The typical range today is about 240 miles of range per charge, but some vehicles on the market today can go up to 400 miles of range on a full charge of the battery. In terms of electric vehicle infrastructure options, here in the US, electric vehicles have to plug in to recharge. And the rate at which the vehicles recharge is based on the type of equipment that they are charging from. So there's currently 3 different levels, level 1, level 2 charging, and DC fast charging. Level 1, on the lower right-hand corner here, adds 3 to 5 miles of range to your car per hour that you're plugged in. And you don't even need a charging station to do level 1 charging. You can do it straight from a 120 volt outlet, as long as it's a dedicated circuit. And it can cost nothing. I charge at home in my garage, and this is what I use, and there was no infrastructure, new infrastructure needed. And it costs about, if you're a ComEd customer, it costs about 11 cents per kilowatt hour to charge at your home. Level 2 charging, you may have this at home. This is 240 volt. So this is a plug that you would, if you have an electric dryer, this is the same kind of plug. It doubles the capacity to charge your vehicle. Most level 2 stations will provide 10 to 40 miles of range per hour that you're charging. If you're charging at home, you could have a station, or you could just have the plug. Some vehicles come with the charging cord that can plug into that outlet, or you can buy it, even on Amazon today. If you charge this way at home, it's the same as with level 1. It's 11 cents per kilowatt hour. If you charge publicly, it can cost between 20 and 30 cents per kilowatt hour. So you are paying a little bit of a premium to be able to charge on the go, typically because that infrastructure there's third parties investing in it and wants to recoup their investment. DC fast charging is the fastest charging we currently have today in the United States. It can recharge an electric vehicle within up to 80% of its full capacity within an hour. Typically today, so this is 480 volts, so you would not have this at home. This would be found in the public, on interstate corridors, in areas where there's a lot of multi-unit dwellings. So this is very much a public-facing charging solution, not something you'd have at home. And on average in the U.S., it costs about 40 to 60 cents per kilowatt hour to use these stations. But here in the Chicago area, I haven't seen anything more than 43 cents. And so to compare the cost to charge with gasoline costs, so 11 cents per kilowatt hour is about $1.10 per gasoline gallon equivalent. So at home, it is very attractive to have access to charge at home, especially overnight. But as you climb up that scale, the faster the charging, publicly accessible, you're paying a premium. You get all the way to DC fast charging, and you're paying about the equivalent of what gasoline can be. On the left-hand side of our slide here, This is called the charging pyramid. And what the pyramid shows is where charging typically takes place today. So today, the vast majority, I think it's 80%, according to Argonne, of charging takes place at home overnight. And then as you move up the pyramid, you find people charging at work, charging at public stations, and then those DC fast charging stations that I mentioned are at the very top. The cost for the infrastructure ascends, or is higher as you ascend the pyramid. So like I said, charging at home, the infrastructure can be a lot more affordable. The charge is much more affordable. It can climb in cost as you go up the pyramid. And then some of these DC fast charging, like super stations that they're proposing for interstate corridors, these sites can cost at least $500,000. So it's a huge investment, very high powered stations, and they want enough capacity for several vehicles to be able to charge at the same time and get that super fast recharging rate. So I stole a couple of slides from the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning on to help show the network of public charging stations in the Northeast Illinois. So basically, the takeaway from this slide is that public charging is primarily concentrated in Chicago, and in Chicago, it's primarily concentrated in downtown. Charging is primarily market-driven, or public charging is primarily market-driven, and is invested in wealthier communities. And you can access the Department of Energy's alternative fuel infrastructure resource to see where stations are nearby. CMAP overlaid economic indicators on the map as well, and showed and demonstrated that the investments in, this market-driven investment in public charging is leaving some communities behind in access to public charging. So public charging is, while right now a lot of people charge at home, it's still very important because people have lower range electric vehicles, people live in multi-unit dwellings and don't have access at home, or they may not be able to invest at this time in charging at home because it may trigger additional electrical work that they don't want to take on right now. And so public, while it isn't as prevalent in use today, it is still very important to having a robust EV market. And if you don't have access to public charging in your community, then you don't have access to EVs. EVs have a lower total cost of ownership, and they have, due to the lower fueling costs, maintenance costs, and you can't access this clean vehicle technology. So here in Elmhurst, there's about 33,000 passenger vehicles registered, and about 506 EVs, well, exactly 506 EVs currently registered according to the Illinois Secretary of State's website, which is about 1.5% of the vehicle population. There are 5 public charging locations, thank you, with 9 level 2 charging stations. If you're looking at the state's goal of 1 million electric vehicles by 2030, Elmhurst's contribution to that goal, which is about 13% of vehicles, is 4,290 vehicles. So vehicles are coming down in price. The manufacturers there's gonna be a lot more product and choice and availability of electric vehicles in the coming decade, even like the next 5 years. And one of the key restraints or barriers to EV adoption is the infrastructure and the infrastructure costs. So something that the city of Chicago and other communities are considering, or what Chicago did was we passed an update to our zoning code to require new buildings, new infrastructure to include the considerations and planning for future electric vehicle charging stations. And so we went with the middle option here, EV ready. So when people talk about EV readiness for buildings, it's kind of in 3 different categories: EV capable, EV ready, and EV installed. capable, you assign capacity within the electrical box, you run the conduit. But we went this step forward with EV Ready because it you actually pull the wires to a receptacle. And just with that infrastructure, as I mentioned, level 2 stations, you could charge an EV from there. You don't need a station. It could plug in directly to that setup. And it also ties that electric capacity to the charging. It can't be pulled to something else that the building might want to pull from it. You can also comply with the city's requirement, which is 20% of parking spaces for developments of a certain size. You can comply by actually installing the charging infrastructure. And the reason why is because it's pennies on the dollar to plan and make ready the infrastructure during construction. Having to go back and retrofit space can be cost prohibitive, but there are incentives that Tim will be talking about later that can help to offset some of those costs. And while in Elmhurst, I think it's 80% of residents live in single-family homes. 20% of your neighbors live in multi-unit dwellings. And multi-unit dwellings, while most people are charging at home today, we're going to see more and more people in multi-unit dwellings want to adopt electric vehicles. And it is challenging because of the shared nature of the infrastructure. And Tim will go into a little bit more detail on that during his presentation. I wanted to highlight that we have been working on a project with other Clean Cities coalitions across the country to identify the barriers for EV charging infrastructure at multi-unit dwellings, to demonstrate some innovative technologies and ways to make it more affordable and easier to access for multi-unit dwellings. And then the end result is this toolkit that now exists called the EVCI Vehicle Charging Innovations for Multi-Unit Dwellings website, which this tool never existed before. So every multi-unit dwelling is different. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. And so what has been lacking is a path or like a self-selecting system for like to develop a roadmap to plan for EV infrastructure for your multi-unit dwelling. So I'm just going to very quickly, if you are a resident, if you are a building manager, if you're the owner, if you're the HOA for a condo, this system on the website will help you through a step-by-step process regarding your role in multi-unit dwellings to help you come up with solutions and help identify and address the barriers to EV charging. There's a ton of information and resources on the website. We actually just held a webinar last week that Tim spoke at, and the recording for the webinar is in the information. The slides are all available on our Clean Cities webpage. If you'd like to go back or share this with someone who's considering EV charging at their multi-unit dwelling, this is a great information resource. And before I turn it over to Tim, I just wanted to go into a little bit of detail about the state's electric vehicle rebate program. So this program is a result of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. It's a rebate for the purchase of a new or used electric vehicle. They've already had one cycle of funding. They are about to open up the second cycle, which will start November 1st and run through the end of January. You have to apply and purchase the vehicle during the application period. So the last cycle closed at the end of September. So we believe, and this hasn't been clarified yet because the new cycle hasn't been released by the Illinois EPA, that if you purchase a vehicle now, so in October, we believe you will not be able to qualify for the program. You have to have purchased it after, for the first cycle, you had to have purchased it after July 1st, which is when the first cycle opened. So we're anticipating that the EPA will be consistent, that you will have to have purchased the vehicle after November 1st of this year. And all the information is available on the EPA's website for the program, but I just wanted to go into a couple of details. So the rebate itself is $4,000, and as I mentioned, that is for a new electric vehicle or used. The The plug-in electric vehicles that I mentioned earlier do not qualify. This has to be a 100% electric or battery electric vehicle. So no plug-in hybrids, no regular hybrids. Over time, the incentive does ramp down for vehicles to $2,000 starting in 2026, and then $1,500 in 2028. And there is, if you don't choose a vehicle, electric vehicle, passenger vehicle, you could also select an electric motorcycle and receive a $1,500 rebate for that for electric vehicles or electric motorcycles. The rebates are not guaranteed. So the General Assembly identified a budget for this program. It was about $17.9 million that they started making available in July of this year. And as per the application and per the information about the program, they will issue rebates until funding is completely expended. So they don't owe you a rebate if you've participated, if you've followed all the requirements of the program. They can only issue as many rebates as they have funding for that budgeted year. So they've already had a cycle, and they have an inventory of how many rebate applications they did receive, and assuming that every single one of those applications is awarded $4,000, there's still about half of the money left, we anticipate. So there may be enough money for this second cycle, but we might have to wait until the next state budget year, July of 2023, to see a third cycle open up. Okay, skip these. The state does have a frequently asked questions document available. The application is available, the rebate application is available in multiple languages, and they do have an email address for you to send any questions to. And if you're interested in looking at electric vehicles, what EVs are available, would they be the right fit for you? There are a couple of different resources you can turn to. I did bring today with me this American Lung Association developed table. It has all of the battery electric and hybrid electric vehicles that are currently available in the U.S. today. And it is a great resource to identify the right electric vehicle for you. I included a bunch of other resources in my slides. We will have these slides available on the Chicago Area Clean Cities Coalition's website following today's event. I don't know if the organizers today also will make these available, but we'll make sure you have access to them. Follow us on the Coalition on social media, where we post information and updates about all these incentive programs as they come available. And that's it for me, and I'll turn it over to Tim, and we'll take questions after Tim's presentation. Thanks, Tim.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Sam. Nope. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things, as Sam mentioned. One is the Empower program, and the other is kind of some what I go through when I go into condominiums and apartments to figure out what to do with EV charging, was something Sam was talking about. So the Empower program, as it reads, is the Equitable Mobility Powering Opportunities for Workforce Electrification Readiness. I don't know who makes these names up, but I call it the Workplace Charging Program. And basically, it has some simple goals. We want to implement workforce charging. We want to make it easier for people who have businesses, for their employees to be able to bring their EVs and charge. We're going to do that by raising awareness for employers about the technical and commercial requirements, and then encourage them to do installations of EV chargers. This is actually a national program. It's a Clean Cities national program. And it's an alliance of all the coalitions within Clean Cities. And I mentioned raising awareness, get people to install charging stations. And so we locally, Chicago Area Clean Cities is one of the coalitions that's working on it. And the steps, we're in the process now of launching this, where we're going to be reaching out to employers and say, hey, here's the program. We're going to also, like in Illinois, we'll talk about the incentives and help them make decisions, understand what they're getting into. We've got to find interested employers. We started a list, who might be a good candidate to put in EV chargers. And then for those interested, we'll actually go out and do site assessments and do quotations. And ultimate goal is to get workplace EV chargers. That's it. EVSE is electric vehicle supply equipment. And you can get more information at the link below. So the federal goal is to reach at least 2,000 employers with kind of the awareness port, and then get 650 or more employers to install. And within that, typically you do multiples, so the goal is to get at least 3,500 chargers. And one of the sub-goals is 20% in diverse employers, communities of color, underserved communities. And then one of the other goals is to get information back from the employers and continue to improve the program. So here in Illinois, our goal is to present this to at least 80 employers, complete 24 EV charging station installations. And as I mentioned, we're going to tie in the incentives to make sure, first question I get when I go in to do EV charger installs is, what are the incentives? And I'll talk about those in a second. So if anybody's interested, you could reach out to Clean Cities or myself. I've been engaged to be the installer, communicator for the program in Illinois. So next thing is talk about the multiple unit dwellings or multiple family dwellings, as I prefer. My business is such that I spend hours every week in parking garages and electrical rooms. I've actually done a couple site assessments here in Elmhurst, and I spend a lot of time in the city. I get a lot of the same questions, same concerns, and I'm going to kind of go through my experience in doing that. The first thing we want to look at is, what's driving this? Well, Sam was talking about, climate change. There's good legislation out there at the state and federal level. And what it's doing is it's driving the demand for EVs. And this particular chart is basically saying by 2030, 50% of the new sales of passenger vehicles will be electric by 2030. And at the same time, within our region, a significant number of people live in multiple family dwellings. It's 60% in the city of Chicago. It's under 40% in Cook County. Nationwide, it's over 30%. So there's a lot of people asking the same questions. And, how can they charge at home? Not everybody wants to pay 50 cents a kilowatt hour at a fast charger. If they can do it at home, it's obviously more convenient. But at the same time, it's very challenging from an economic standpoint. I'm not going to go through this. Sam kind of went through this. We're talking the middle one. I'm going to focus on level 2 for multiple family. I want to go through a few terms just to baseline because not everybody's used to the alphabet soup. So EVSE, as I mentioned, is electric vehicle supply equipment. EV charging stations are one of those. It's basically whatever equipment is taking the electricity from the facility and getting it into the vehicle in a safe manner. We look up in the upper right-hand corner. That's a whole bunch of level 2 stations. They have different features, but they fundamentally do the same thing. And there's a whole family of portable EVSEs. So they plug into the wall, as again, Sam mentioned. Some other terms that are important. I'm going to call level 2 panels. They're 208 or 240 electrical panels, circuit breaker panels, as shown on the right. Everybody's got them in their homes. Believe it or not, you actually have 240 coming in your homes. And you'll see that in the multiple family dwellings as well. One other thing that I just want to differentiate is something called continuous load. So when you plug in your EV, certain current flows at a certain rate. The typical one for most chargers is 32 amperes or amps. They come in 40 and 50 and 60 and up to 80 amps. But we're going to talk about 32 amps. And when you have a 32 amp breaker, you need 32 amp continuous load, you need a 40 amp breaker. It has to be a little bigger so that it's, if something goes wrong, the circuit breaker pops. So if you have a 32 amp circuit, you have a 40 amp breaker. Sometimes that gets confused in the mix. I like to make sure that's clear. There's also the other component. If you're a resident and you're thinking you're going to be investing in EV charging in your building, you're going to be thinking about this branch run or branch circuit. So basically, you got a panel over there, and you've got 4 EVSEs, electric vehicle supply equipment. And each of them has a circuit breaker that it's fed from. That it branches from the panel to the charger. That's called a branch run. In some cases, especially for a larger parking structure, if you just have branch runs, you could have somebody who's like right next to the electrical room or somebody who's a couple hundred feet away. That could be the difference of $2,000 or $12,000 for that two residents. So on the lower right hand, some buildings are now distributing the power available in the panels out so it's closer to the parking spaces. And the idea here is you run conduit out into the parking area, you put in junction boxes near parking spaces, and then the dotted lines are what I call the last leg. So that's the last 20 or 30 feet of conduit. So it's the same for everybody. Otherwise, you'll have this disparity in costs. Another one, I don't know how many of you have been in your electrical rooms. There's usually big gray boxes. That's where the power comes in from ComEd. And from there, it goes into EV panels. If it's 208, if it's higher voltage, like 480, you have to transform it. So if you want to use it for EV charging, you need 208 or 240. That's level 2 voltage. And you may have to do that in your building, or you may have to engage the utility. The other thing, there's kind of two groups of applications. There's shared charging, dedicated charging. You've probably all seen the charge point chargers or something like that, where anybody with a smart card can use it. That's a shared charge. I call it many to one. You have it access controlled, so only the driver can engage it, and they get billed for the power. And all that's automated. On the dedicated side, that's typically in an HOA or in a condominium. Each resident has their own EV charger, and only they can use it. So it's a one-to-one relationship, and the billing of that can be automated, or it can be semi-automated, or in some buildings they talk about having an honor system, which doesn't usually work. So this is the kind of decision steps I go through when I meet with prospective condominiums and apartments. The first thing is the building or the group has to believe there's value in installing, in particular, the infrastructure, which for those that have been kind of studied, it adds value to the facility. It adds, especially for deeded spaces, it adds value to a deeded space. You can actually put that in your costing, but it has to be something that people recognize. Tied to that, you want to know where you're going to put the charging, infrastructure and the chargers. The costs vary depending on those logistics. You also want to make sure it's very clear to all parties who owns what, who pays for what. One of the things that I always recommend up front is you say, how many EV chargers do you need? Well, you talk to your residents. You get a survey going, and it's basically driving the demand side of the equation. There are also variable types of parking processes. You've got self-parking, deeded spaces, everybody pulls in their own spot, or you may have valet and variations on the theme. As I mentioned, we want to have standardized charging. If one person can have 32 amps, another person has 80 amps, for example, that means the 80 amps is taking up almost 3 equivalent of the 32. So you're reducing the capacity of the building to serve more residents. A big one, of course, is how does it get paid for? How do we get our money back? Is this the investments, let's say in EV charging infrastructure, does that get spread out to all residents, or only those residents that are participating? Are you going to have revenue generation? Do you charge more than the cost of electricity? And if you do that, how do you manage the rates? Tied to that is how are you metering the electricity and billing? Sam mentioned incentives. There may be incentives, I'll talk about in a second, for the charging and for the infrastructure. You want to be looking at that as part of your business decision. There also may be regulations. Sam mentioned EV ready, EV capable. There are communities where this may apply. Today it's been largely or almost exclusively on new construction, but there are initiatives underway to do it for retrofit construction. So if your building is going to do something, there may be regulations coming that will have some stipulations. I also get involved in subterranean charging, and sometimes you have poor cell signal or Wi-Fi signal. You may have to have that looked at. You may have to add some boosting. And one thing depending on the complexity of the initiatives that people want to undertake, it's not always a straightforward answer, so we do site assessments. And basically we want to say, how much capacity do you actually have to charge EVs, and how much is that going to cost? One last piece of the puzzle is called EV energy management systems. Some people kind of call power sharing or load sharing. There's actually, you can, in addition to splitting the amps, let's say, like showing over here, you got one circuit breaker feeding 4 chargers. The chargers talk to one another. If there's 4 vehicles pulled in at the same time, or plugged in, they each get 8 amps. If 2 of them drop off, they each get 16. If there's only one that gets 32. So they're sharing the amps. And what does it allows more people to plug in at the same time, and as one party gets off, the other one gets more power. You can also do time allocations where there's a first come, first serve, or you can say who charges when based on time of day. And what it really does is you're going to find out in most buildings, you don't want to call the utility until you have to. You want to use the power you have. This is one of the best ways of doing it, is by sharing the power, because people don't charge at the same time fundamentally, and they don't need to charge for 4 or 8 hours. They may only need 2 hours because they only drive 20 miles a day or 30 miles a day. And when you're planning, you should be thinking about this. How many are we going to need? What are we going to do? Because calling a utility means bigger bucks, and it adds a lot of time to the schedule. Before you call the utility, you kind of have control of the situation. So this is something we do also, is basically we'll go in and we'll help basically an HOA board, property management team to make decisions. So we develop and deliver a plan that kind of lays all this out, which is we start by looking at your electrical infrastructure. What do you have? How much capacity do you have? We look at the bills. We look at the physical layout, and we determine like what you're using, what you have, what's left over. That's what you can use for EV charging. So that becomes the supply, and you're trying to balance that with the demand and look at what you can do today versus the future. This allows long-term planning for the condominium or the apartment building, and allows you to make decisions based on kind of real information. So this is the kind of questions we want to answer. We start out by having that demand information, and then we want to figure out the supply and see how to fit those two together in terms of do you stage it? Do we want to plan for the energy management? Do we need to engage utility? That's something you want to know about, because that can be an extended process. Do you want to distribute the power? Do you want to put panels closer to the parking spaces? Do you want to put in these conduit networks? Those are big questions. There's good money involved. And then which charger do you want? Do you want all your building automated? Do you want to manage that? And so those are some of the things that we try to work through and offer options during an assessment. So basically, this is the sequence of events that we go through. Go in a building first time. Do you have any panels I can pull some power from? If not, do you have any switch gear? The big gray boxes that I can pull 208 or 240 power from, and then you create new panels. If not, do you have any higher voltage, like 480, that you can transform and make 208 or 240 panels? And then the last step in here, before you call the utility, is see if you can use the energy management to get more people involved in the charging. At that point, if you've squeezed all the first 4 boxes, you call the utility, you got to have more power pulled into the building, which adds additional costs. So, and in every case, you have to deal with the branch run. So these are kind of the steps and the cost centers for EV charging. Just want to paint just as kind of a simple example. We see this a lot. This is for 4 new chargers, existing panel that has spare capacity. And you're basically running individual branch runs from the panel to the chargers. And the cost is a function of where you are, where your parking space is relative to the panel. And as I said, there's maybe $3,000 to $12,000 that typically the resident pays for. And that it's independent of the charger itself. This is a little more comprehensive of a solution. This example, we're going to put in 18 new chargers in a building on 3 floors, saying there's 1 existing panel that we can use, and we're going to add 2 new panels, but we got transform power, and we're going to do this conduit network. So here's the idea. You take this existing panel, and we run circuits out, and the blue lines are this. We're getting them out so that these little junction boxes are near the parking spaces. So we lay it out and make sure that works. The next thing we want to do is we transform power from a higher voltage to lower voltage. And then we add a couple of panels up on the second and the third floor in this case. And then we do this distribution out to the groups. So this is kind of an ideal. In actuality, this is the lowest cost solution for getting this many people involved if everybody already is signed up at the beginning. One last piece of the puzzle. When you do this, if you want to get this built at some point, you have to have a permit, which requires engineering documentation. And this is typically what we come out of with the site evaluation is a pre-plan for the engineering. The customers will say, okay, we want scenario A or B or C. And then the next step is they're going to invest in engineering documentation, which you need for a permit. And that depends on the complexity. Like when we just run some branch runs and put in some chargers, it's very simple. There's a simple permit application. There's not a lot of cost. But we get involved in, say, that one I just showed, where you're adding panels and transferring power. The requirement of any municipality is going to be more complicated. You've got to have all these different engineering deliverables that the city will spell out. You need a professional engineering stamp. It's more cost to do the engineering. The permits cost more. But this is the process that you would go through. One of the other thing is once these are developed, you can, as an HOA or apartment owner, you could shop these engineering. You could send it out to multiple vendors and get quotes in your RFP process. As well as if it does involve increasing the power coming into the building, the utility requires the same information. So last couple of slides here on the process. I mentioned shared EV chargers. That's for owned or rented. Basically, the facility owner pays for everything. Typically, they install the charger. They pay for all the electricity bills, but then there'll be this automated system where people have these smart cards. They set the pricing. They can put margins on it. They can have tiered pricing. You can have residents at one rate and visitors at another rate. And the money that comes in, any difference between the cost and what they get, goes to perhaps paying for this investment. And then this is managed by a network service provider that refunds the money. And another thing is if you can assess idle fees. So one of the classics is somebody charged their EV and they didn't move their car. And now nobody can get in there. Well, you can actually say, let's say that we're paying about $1 an hour to charge. You can start charging them $5 an hour. That motivates people to move their vehicle. This is another one for the facility owner where you have dedicated chargers. And the drawing up there is basically saying we've got a facility panel that's metered, going to 4 different chargers. Basically, the facility pays for the infrastructure, they pay for the utility, pays the electricity, and they manage the billing because it's going through their, if you will, ComEd account. There's ways of automating this that can all be set up that it all gets taken care of automatically. Or there are other options where people say, well, I use so much electricity, I'll give you this much money, the honor system. In my experience, it doesn't work and it doesn't happen, but people talk about it. You can also do this manually. You can measure electricity, write it down on a clipboard, and submit it to the property manager who says, what do I do with this? They're not real keen on that. So you can also have a smart panel which captures the amount of electricity used and communicates it over the web. And you can do this on a less than automated level. So there's a number of options that each have costs and resources to go with them. And on the resident side, then I'm just going to go on to the dedicated because it's for the shared one. They're a user; they get to use electricity. So the dedicated, there's kind of 2 scenarios. One is they're basically using the facility power, which is almost all of them, where you've got out of the garage, you've got a panel that supplies the lighting and such. You're also supplying EV charging. The whole right one is it's actually going through the resident's meter and their panel. So you're pulling the power out of their panel. So that's called behind the meter. But basically, with the dedicated charger, the resident will pay for the branch run, the charging station, installation. They'll pay for the electricity. There may be a monthly fee to use the station. And there may be an infrastructure fee. So if the building had to spend $50,000, they may have to spend whatever their portion is to get into the, to get access to the infrastructure. And on the behind the meter, the difference is you're not going through the facility power, but you still pay for all those costs. One thing I tried to do is, because it's probably a little confusing, but this is the cost per unit on the left. So if you have a parking space and you're doing dedicated charging, if you've got existing panels, this is saying, I said it's between $2,000 and $12,000, so it's maybe an average of about $7,000. With new panels, somebody had to pay for that, it goes up. If you put in this conduit network, you can actually reduce the unit cost. Transform power, you have a lot more people that can use it costs a lot more money. And then if you distribute with the conduit networks, it brings the cost down again. And this is showing basically if you use power sharing. So with the branch runs, it doesn't have an influence, but the further you go to the right, you actually have a reduction in the per unit space cost because you're sharing the power. So right now, Sam talked about the first one. There's also an EV charger rebate program that's hopefully comes out, I'll say, this year. Maybe that's optimistic, but it was supposed to be out July 1st. This is another IEPA program. The way the legislation or the law is written, it says up to 80% of the make-ready costs are covered, which is the infrastructure I was just talking about. They are looking at multifamily dwellings as one of the candidates to get included in the program. There's also a program that's coming out next year. It's called Beneficial Electrification. The goal of the state and the utility is to drive the utilities to be smarter about where they generate electricity and how they use it. So it's a grid optimization. It's tying in solar energy, energy storage, and electric vehicle charging. So imagine those all working together somehow. That's the goal. And to the extent you do that, there will be more rebates available. And they're talking about a special provision within the world of multiple family dwellings that the utilities may support. For example, bringing more power to buildings. We don't know what the cost shares are going to be. There's also some federal incentives. We have a clean vehicle credit, which it depends on how much money you make, depends on where your car and your battery was made, but that's something that's active at the beginning of the year. It's a tax credit. There's also one for previously owned, which is really, it's focused on lower income people, that you can get the lesser of $30,000 or 30% of the cost of $4,000. And then there's also something for personal alternative fuel vehicle, for the vehicle, same kind of a thing. And multiple family dwellings are specifically included. So this is my last slide. If you're interested, you want to kind of dig in, this is the link that Sam talked about, the EVCI MUD. And this is a book you can get from our website. That goes into a lot more detail than I just covered on the subject. And with that, I thank you. Oh, one last thing. There are a number of extra slides. I won't go through them, but they're here. It's just more information.